Our next presenter is Jean Bellinger. Over to you.
Hello. I'm going to talk about, hopefully, all right. A model is a story, an alternative to inflicting yourself on others, and this will make sense before too long. And if you have questions in the midst of this presentation, type something in the chat and Bruce will catch it and ping me, that because I think it's better to answer the questions in the context of when they came up as opposed to waiting until the end of the presentation when I can't remember where I was at that point in time. And I'm probably not likely to get lost in the midst of this. So in 1975, I read Stafford Beer's Platform for Change, and some have claimed that I have been mentally irregular ever since for numerous reasons. And over the last 48 years, there have been numerous trial and learning aha moments, which are far too long to cover in this presentation, though Bruce said that he will post the link to this model that I'm presenting from. And when you mouse over things, there are blue links that will take you to that particular model so that you can watch the videos that are attached to it. So from my perspective, a model is just some simplification of reality intended to promote understanding. To the extent it does that, it's a good model. If it doesn't, work on it some more or throw it away and create a new one that accomplishes what it is that you're trying to understand. And when I began this, my worst enemy was a blank sheet of paper because I wanted to start in the right place. We've been taught since early school years that it's not good to make mistakes. So I want to start in the right place. But since I don't know where the right place is, I can't start. So I still have a blank piece of paper, and it's a vicious reinforcing cycle. And I finally realized that it doesn't matter where I start. While everything is related, everything isn't relevant. So if I start someplace and with a valid investigation of relationships, I'll come up with a meaningful model. Sometimes there's too much stuff in it. Sometimes there's too little stuff in it. But I adopted the Nike phrase, just do it, and work on it till it gets better, or hopefully it gets better. So then one day, after, 30 years of developing models, one day I asked myself this really stupid question: how do I develop a model? And I realized that over time I had developed a process for developing models that I didn't believe was as simple as it turned out to be. And I didn't know exactly where it came from, but I'll take it wherever it is. I begin with a situation or topic that I want to understand. And I ask, what influences this and how? And then I ask, what does this influence and how? And then I ask questions 2 and 3 repeatedly until I run out of things that I know. And then I have to explain my model to someone else, asking them how to improve it. And then I have to try and not be an idiot and argue with them about their feedback. And finally, what are the implications of the understanding that we have developed? So the whole idea is to understand relationships and their implications to get a sense of what it is that we're dealing with. So I essentially grow a model, or I grow an understanding piece by piece as I find things that I think are related. So if I start with unwanted pregnancy and ask myself, well, it influences unwanted births and abortions, and it's influenced by sex and use of contraceptions, and financial insecurity, and unwanted births influences children in poor families and children given up for adoption, and it's influenced by illegal abortion and abortion. And I can just continue to do this. And the thing is not to explain this model to you at this point. It's just to show that this is how I grow an understanding of relationships and their implications. And some people have labels that they affix to these diagrams. There are a set of terms that I seldom use. I shy away from, even when I'm talking to people that have been drinking the KoolAid for a long time. So in this way, I go ahead and grow my understanding of this set of relationships and their implications, trying to figure out what it means and what to do with it. And the thing is, what happens, and this is the same Afghan strategy model that Joseph displayed, we tend to develop these relationship models that are incomprehensible. Of course, if you watch Eric Berlow's TED Talk on simplifying complexity, he does a nice job sorting this one out. So the thing is, here's where I spent decades inflicting my understanding on other people, because I would send them these things which were completely incomprehensible. And after a couple of days, if they sent back anything, they would send back a comment like, well, that's nice. And what I came to realize, what they really wanted to say is, why'd you send this to me? Because there was no way that they were going to understand it. And to get out of this, one day I made this connection between a model and a play. If you go to a play and you watch the relationships unfold between the actors from one act to another, if the play is done relatively well, when you leave, you take the story with you, because as Bateson said, it's the pattern that connects. It happens for movies or plays or any kind of story, because there's a pattern to the story. And I was just delighted about this. So I had to set out and actually create something to demonstrate that I thought I figured this out. So I created this model about the boy who cried wolf. And some of these images don't show up, and I don't know why, but there's a boy who's tending sheep, and if he cries wolf, the townspeople come running. What happens is he gets bored tending sheep, and he wants attention, because that's what he got when the townspeople came running. So he cries wolf, the townspeople come running, and he becomes the center of attention, and his boredom is relieved. Though, as Sengi said in the fifth discipline, you can never do just one thing. So if he cries wolf, and there is a wolf, that's truth, which improves the belief-o-meter and the likelihood that the townspeople will come running in the future, making him the center of attention. Though if he cries wolf and there is no wolf, it's a lie, which decreases the belief-o-meter, decreasing the likelihood that the townspeople will come running. And so I've got Aesop's fable, The Boy Who Cried Wolf, in 3 loops. And I'm absolutely elated with this, because I did a video voiceover of the unfolding of this model, and I sent it to somebody. And a couple of days later, they sent me back the story from the wolf's perspective, which for me was an unbelievable aha moment, because I said, oh, there's the boy's perspective, the wolf's perspective, the townspeople, the farmer, the sheep, the wolf, the land. And unless I actually embrace all of those perspectives, whatever I believe about this set of relationships is biased. And it was just amazing. So at that point, I rapidly connected that with the set of habit cards from the Waters Foundation, which are 14 cards that I use as a crib to ask myself, did I consider this perspective? And so seek to understand the big picture. And if you flip the card over, there are questions to ask to sort of ping yourself. Did you think about that aspect? Or change over time, or change in perspectives, or circular nature. And there are 14 of these, and there's a copy of this that sits on my desktop, and I use it all the time, because it does just what I needed to do, which is to sort of ping me to say, did you remember to think about this perspective of this set of relationships? So, well, this wasn't supposed to happen, but it does from time to time. Another model that I developed sometime in the past, who remembers when, I'm sitting at the table in the morning having a pleasant breakfast, And my wife yells down from upstairs, "Are you finally going to clean up that unsightly growth around the bird feeder? Because I'm getting tired of looking at it." And just as that happens, this whole set of past relationships flashes before my mind and my eyes as to how I got myself in this predicament. I deal with a lot of frustration on a daily basis, and having a pleasant breakfast helps me deal with the frustration, but the frustration detracts from the pleasant breakfast, and this is a vicious reinforcing structure. And the birds outside over the past several days have really been adding to my pleasant breakfast. So after this happens for several days, I say, "Self, why don't you install a bird feeder? Because I believe the bird feeder will increase the birds at the feeder, increasing the birds outside, and help me have a pleasant breakfast." And after I install the bird feeder, well, it actually happens. I mean, it improves, it does what I wanted it to do, but it improves the attractiveness of the garden, which attracts more birds to the feeder, and also adds to my pleasant breakfast. Though, have you checked the price of bird seed as of late? So the need to buy bird seed adds to my frustration. And the birds at the feeder create spillage, which increases the need to buy bird seed, adding to my frustration. And the bird feeder attracts the universal eating machine, squirrels, which decreases the birds at the feeder, increases the need to buy bird seed, increases spillage, and I've got more frustration. And the spillage is what's promoting the unsightly growth, which increases my frustration because I have to figure out how to get rid of it. The spillage is also attracting rodents, which I guess my wife hasn't noticed because she didn't complain about those. And the birds are pooping all over the railing, and I have to figure out how to clean this up and deal with this. So the question is, what's the real problem? And this is a point where some thoughts from other people would be really good. What's the problem that I'm dealing with? Don't all answer at once.
Is the problem how to have a more pleasant breakfast, how to improve the pleasantness of the breakfast?
Okay. That some of the comments in the past have told me that the problem was my wife.
Well, if you give up on the pleasant breakfast, you probably go all set also.
Well, who actually prepares the breakfast, you or your wife?
I usually fix my own breakfast.
Okay. So if you got rid of the wife, it wouldn't affect the quality of the breakfast. Who does the shopping?
We could go on for a while here.
Yeah.
For a while, I thought that the real problem was my tendency to not think before I act. Because when I decided to install a bird feeder, I mean, our tendency seems to be that when we think we know the answer to the problem, we stop thinking. All right. We don't think about the implications of what it is that we're about to do. So I thought about what the bird feeder would accomplish, but I didn't think about any of the other implications of taking that action. So for a long time, I thought that was the problem. And it seems as though over time, as I thought about this more and more, I realized that the real problem is my frustration, which I never mentioned addressing in the model except for the pleasant breakfast. And is our tendency, we often come up with coping strategies to deal with what we perceive to be the problem, as opposed to eliminating the source of the frustration, which is the longer term better answer. And by focusing on the coping strategies, it becomes a dependency, negating the likelihood that the real source of the solution comes to mind or gets worked on or whatever. We have a tendency. See, now I messed up my presentation, but we'll get it figured out. So where we go next? So the tendency seems to be that what we identify as the problem are really symptoms of the problem. I remember Ackoff repeatedly saying, regardless of where it is that you initially identify the problem to be, a thorough investigation will almost always show that the real problem is someplace else. Right? And though if we react to what we perceive to be the problem, usually we're trying to fix symptoms, and putting band-aids on child's knees doesn't keep them from falling off bicycles, right? I mean, they need to learn to ride. So in continuing to do that, and something that Joe also talked about, this model that I developed, well, I didn't actually develop, I actually repurposed it from somebody else because it was such a nice model. I can present this model the way I did the Boy Who Cried Wolf. And I can unfold this model one set of relationships at a time. Though there are 22 relationships in this model, and by the time I get to the 10th one, you won't remember what I was talking about in the first one. So I finally realized, I mean, and this is the kind of thing that I inflicted upon people forever, is just giving them this. And even though I was sending them a video that they could watch that unfolded the story, it was overwhelming. So I had to go back and say, okay, this is what it says. What does it mean? What's it really trying to tell me? And I realized that for any set of relationships such as this, if you can figure out the real pieces of the puzzle, there's a whole bunch of things that deal with accommodating birth, a whole bunch of things that have to deal with avoiding birth, and a bunch of things that have to do with avoiding pregnancy. The realization that came when I did this was, well, if I focus on doing this, it actually detracts from doing this. And I set up another vicious reinforcing structure, which in turn actually is a shifting the burden structure. And this focusing on this detracts from focusing on this, which is another vicious reinforcing structure, which is part of another shifting the burden structure. And as it turns out, the model really talks about two shifting the burden structures that are mushed together. And in getting lost in the trees in the other model and not knowing what forest I was in, this relationship and this relationship are not in the other model, which means that it's very easy to get off track and pursue dealing with the situation in a way that will not create long-term relief for the situation. Which led me to thinking about frequently recurring structures. Some people have another name for them, though you probably already realized from this presentation that there are certain terms that I seldom refer to, even when talking to people that have been drinking the Kool-Aid for a long time. So that you can set out frequently recurring structures were initially proposed by Bertalanffy in the 30s. He claimed that there were fundamental underlying structures that operated across all branches of science. And what he conceived as was something called general systems teaching, but it was written in German and the translator screwed up the translation. So if one understood the structures that were operating, you could carry a lot of your learning from one discipline to another, because you would simply have to figure out what structures were operating and what the labels were on them, because frequently recurring structures have well-defined sets of relationships with very characteristic patterns of behavior and well-defined strategies for dealing with them. So there are only there's only two things that you can initially set out to do. You can fix a problem or promote growth. Sometimes we do combinations of things, but basically there's just two to start with. But we try to promote growth, and growth leads to decline elsewhere, and partners for growth become adversaries, and growth slows over time or limited resources shared by others, or more than one limit to be addressed. The limit's insufficient capacity, or the tendency is to let the standard slip. On the other side, try to fix a problem, the fix overshoots the goal, or things seem to oscillate endlessly, or linear progress slows over time. Over time, there's a tendency to settle for less. And this ties back into the other half of the set of situations. It's kind of interconnected. Things get better then worse. Partners for growth become adversaries. Underlying cause not being addressed. That's the shifting the burden that I've been talking about. The dependence on the fix develops, which is an addiction structure. Fix creates a problem elsewhere. The underlying problem becomes worse. And as of late, I've been asking myself, are there really any new problems? Or are there just problems that are showing up with new labels on them and we don't realize that they're old problems with new labels? So in terms of when you get to this part of the presentation, if you mouse over these pieces, every one of these pieces, every element here has a qualitative diagram that displays it, a video that describes the structure, and the model that it was created from, which you can actually simulate and play with and get a better sense of the behavior of the set of relationships. And so personally, I developed a lot of models endlessly. And where is this? Some people develop qualitative models and some people develop quantitative models. And I personally believe that there's a lot that we can learn from understanding a set of relationships and their implications at a qualitative level. Though once we begin to ask questions about how much or how long or when, qualitative models don't help. You need to figure out how to simulate the relationships to get a sense of how that evolves over time, because it is simply beyond our capacity to intuit the implications of any model with two or more feedback loops in them. It just, and actually it's one feedback loop and a delay. So this is the template from which I create all of my qualitative models done in Kumu, because Kumu is a free package that you can create however many public models you want for nothing. And it's extremely capable, and it has the ability to create an endless array of different kinds of relationship models. I develop ones that look a lot like loops because they provide the understanding that I'm looking for. And in this template, there are 6 different videos that talk about the evolution of this template over time. Once upon a time, Kumu was a relatively simple environment to use, though the users asked for 1,000 options and they implemented all those also. And it got to the point where I was simply tired of spending the time it took to set up all of the decorations to make them look the way I wanted to, so that I can differentiate between stocks and variables and flows being positive or negative, and whether the loops are contribute or whether they're caution or concern loops, and it's all in the videos. So that's I should say that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Maybe not. I would like to spend just a couple of moments and address something that bothered me endlessly, which was back in the beginning. I spent 20 years trying to develop some level of expertise in something called system dynamics. And along the way, doing a lot of reading and studying, and I couldn't quite come to an understanding as to why it was that there were so many models and methods that claim to embrace the systems paradigm. I thought system dynamics was just fine. And then I ran into a piece of work by Michael C. Jackson called Systems Thinking Creative Holism for Managers. And in that, he presented this 2x3 matrix where he used the complexity of the system itself from simple to complex and the cohesiveness of the participants, where the participants might have similar values and beliefs and interests and come to an agreement on things, pluralist where they have differing opinions and beliefs but can come to an agreement on some things, and then coercive over here, which is a group of people who will never agree on anything. And within each one of these domains, he said there are certain approaches which are likely to provide progress trying to deal with the situation. So for hard systems thinking, and this is not a comprehensive list, this is just a few of them that he mentioned. So each one of these you can type out, click on it, and it shows system dynamics and cybernetics and general systems theory and evolution. And over here you end up with appreciative inquiry and soft systems methodology. And so all of a sudden, I had a sense of why there were so many models and methods. And I was elated because all of a sudden, I wasn't confused about it anymore. And this lasted for at least a couple of days till I became thoroughly, thoroughly depressed. Because I said, self, you spent 20 years trying to develop some level of expertise in system dynamics, and Jackson's telling you got to learn a dozen different methods. You ain't that smart. So to work my way out of this depression, I finally realized, at least from my own perspective, what they are doing in all of these different methods is simply trying to understand relationships and their implications. For me, there isn't anything else. So I got to a point where I can carry on a conversation with someone who is pursuing any one of these methods, and I don't have to argue about their methods because I understand their intent is to understand relationships and implications to an extent where they can figure out how to deal with the situation. So somewhere along the line, I decided that I'm a storyteller of relationships and implications, which is also a recovering systems thinker. Questions? You can't tell me I can go home now because I'm already home.
I can tell you, but it won't be much use.
Okay, Joseph.
I found this really fascinating and really interesting. But what I'd like to know is, what has KoolAid got to do with thinking? You mentioned it a couple of times.
What has Kumu got to do with it?
KoolAid.
No,
Oh, KoolAid.
it's an Americanism, I think.
Yes.
Okay.
It's an American slang for
Yeah.
for drinking the idea.
Okay, because I know I lived in America 25 years, and I know KoolAid is a drink.
Yeah.
But I can't figure out what KoolAid has to do with thinking.
When carried to its evil extension, it leads to the Jonestown Massacre, where those people literally drank poison-laced Kool-Aid.
Ah, okay. I remember that. I was there. I was in America at the time.
Yes, sir.
I have listened to endless discussions or terminology wars about people arguing about what this means or what that means. And they forget that they're trying to understand a set of relationships and their implications. They're fighting about the terminology. And so, which is why I find that I don't get the pushback anymore when I talk to people about understanding relationships and their implications. I took a parallel from Fight Club. The first rule of Fight Club is not to talk about Fight Club. So for me, the first rule of systems thinking is don't talk about systems thinking.
Just do
Talk
it.
about And the other thing was, for most people, creating a model is like a root canal. Okay. In other words, if you think that you don't know how to create a model, and I say to you, let's create a model, the last thing you want to do is create a model, because you already convinced you don't know how to do that. So after, repeated failures, trying to get people listening them to come up with every possible excuse for why not to create a model, I developed what I call the stealth approach to modeling. And that is, if I sit down with you so that you can explain to me what it is that you're wrestling with, I'm not here to help you. I'm here for you to help me understand what you're wrestling with. As you begin to tell me, I will ask you if I can take some notes. So I start taking notes as you're describing things to me. And my notes look like a model, but I never mention the word model. I'm just taking notes. And sooner or later, it gets to a point where I begin to ask questions about things that I think are missing in terms of relationships and their connections. And after 15 or 20 minutes, it never ceases to fail. The person is saying, I think we ought to add this piece here and connect this to this. And it works every time. And we've never mentioned model.
I love that. You're doing active brainstorming from the operational and functional perspectives without telling anybody.
Yeah.
Which,
It sounds
and
like
if I
the
tried
early
to tell them
implementation.
about, and if I
Go ahead.
tried to tell them about those various perspectives and explain them to them,
No,
all right, I lose them.
right. You don't.
So the question is, figure out how to do the right kind of things in a manner that they're comfortable with.
It's called speaking the customer's language. And just don't tell them what you're doing, just do it. And if later on they want to know what you did, then you can mention what you did.
Mhm.
But they don't have the anchor points to understand what you're telling them before they've experienced it. I
So
found it teaching.
the most learning experience that I ever had was being invited to a conference to do a 4-hour workshop on what they said was systems thinking. And I had forgotten that I was supposed to do a workshop. So I had all this material prepared that I was going to present. And even I wouldn't want to listen to me for 4 hours. But while I'm having breakfast, I realized that I had to go do a workshop in about 10 minutes and I'm not prepared. So while I was finishing my coffee, I invented one. So I walked into this group of 35 people or so sitting at 6 or 7 tables. And I said, take out a piece of paper. On this piece of paper, write the word cat. A couple inches away from it, write the word mouse. Now draw an arrow from cat to mouse and label it chases. A couple inches away from mouse, write the word mouse hole, draw an arrow from mouse to mouse hole and label it runs to. Now draw an arrow from mouse hole to cat and label it frustrates. These people were absolutely out of control for 4 hours. Because my next comment was, you've now created your first relationship model. If you feel faint, you should leave now. So over a period of 4 hours, these people developed the ability to develop very complex relationship models and tell stories to each other about things that they were wrestling with. And I never taught them the dreaded words. Okay. We just talked about, how does this work and how does this work? When you fill a bathtub and the water goes in, what happens? The water increases. And if you open the drain, what happens? The water goes out. So all we did was talk about things that they already knew. I mean, I've talked to people who say only 5% of the population is capable of systems thinking. Well, from my perspective, the only people that I've ever met that weren't capable of systems thinking were either catatonic or dead. Because you wake up in the morning and you're in bed and you're hungry. So you get up you take a shower, you get dressed, you go to the kitchen, you eat breakfast, you're not hungry anymore. You just satisfied a goal-seeking structure. And you can walk a person through that and ask them about it. And that's half of the puzzle. The other half of the puzzle is, how does the savings account work? Now you know everything that you need to know about whatever complexity of a model that you happen to need to develop, because it's just a mishmash of reinforcing and balancing structures. They're like the electron and the neutron or proton in an atom. Everything else is built out of those two structures.
There's some comments in the chat. Oscar, you mentioned it also applies to teaching by examples instead of theory. Well, you have to mix the two. You give them the example, and then you start introducing the theory, because they can now link the theory to the knowledge they picked up in the example.
Right, right.
And I like the cat mouse hole, but that's only one use case. What happens if the mouse can't run faster than the cat?
I understand. Which, so that you can just continue to ask these questions and get them to extend the relationships.
Yep. And I've been in those situations too, and I come out of those meetings and people say, "How did you know so much about what we're doing?" And I smile, because I don't want to tell them I didn't know anything when I came in. I didn't know very much when I came into the meeting, but I picked up on their buzzwords, and I just added the words why or how before the buzzword, and they went in there and they talked themselves through the whole situation.
There's a marvelous TED Talk by a chef out of New York City called "How I Fell in Love with a Fish," and he's visiting a 27,000 acre fish farm in southern Spain, and he's given this tour by the guy that was responsible for its development, and it's a fish farm that doesn't feed its animals, and it's a fish farm that measures its health based upon the health of its predators, and just on and on and on. And he's just going nuts. And he says to Miguel, "How'd you learn so much about fish?" Miguel says, "Fish? I don't know anything about fish. I'm an expert in relationships."
Okay, there's a question. Oh,
Yeah.
Gene, very nice talk. Could you put your screen back up again? I want to ask you about something on that last Kumu thing. The map that you drew for your whole presentation. Yeah.
Yes.
So this looks like you're talking about your journey over the last 20, 30, 40 years, right? As you went through these various things. Is that correct?
Well, this one is closer. There are more pieces in this one than in that one. All right,
Okay.
but it's still not all of them. I mean, and this is the way that it seemed to make sense. But I have to admit that I'm probably creatively rewriting history based upon how I remember things and how things went together.
Yeah. So if you go back to that other one, I want to ask you a question about that other sketch. Yeah. So you had the frequently recurring structures. I really like the idea of going from problems or symptoms down to frequently recurring structures, but then you go to the Kumu template. So did you abandon the frequently recurring structures, or are the frequently recurring structures in the Kumu template, or what?
No. The frequently occurring structures is another model that I created with Kumu to be able to present. Okay, so this is a Kumu model.
Okay.
And in that model, there's a whole bunch of references about archetypes
But then going back to the other one, you had Kumu after that. So what was the progression to Kumu template? Maybe I missed that.
I thought that I should simply offer it as, in case someone wanted to know where I came up with all these pieces. It's a tool that I use.
Okay, so like the frequently recurring structures that you created in Kumu might have been created with the Kumu template or something. Is that sort of the way I can
Yeah,
read
if
that?
if you look at the pieces, so this particular project was created in Kumu, though if you look at this, this is actually done in Insight Maker, which is the simulation package
Gotcha.
that I use.
Yeah, I got it. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
And I
Okay.
use Insight Maker because it's free. Absolutely free. There's nothing you can buy. And it's web-based. And if you develop a model that you want to share with somebody, all you got to do is send them a URL and they can play with it. And if I sent you this model and you say, well, that's nice, but I'd like to change all this stuff, all you got to do is come up here and clone it and make a version of it that belongs to you.
Yep.
You can ask these questions asynchronously after I upload the video into the sessions, and then Gene can respond and put the URLs in there, or you can put them in the chat and then save the chat. In fact, everybody, don't forget to save the chat before you sign off.
Mm-hmm.
Question on your frequently on those FRQs. Are they templates or patterns? Because it sounds to me like you're talking about templates or patterns.
Well, the frequently recurring structures are all patterns. If you look at them, oh, I shouldn't have started there. Let me get to the end. All right. So it starts with a goal-seeking structure, and it starts with a reinforcing structure. And the growth leads to elsewhere is also a success to the successful structure. It's two reinforcing structures interacting. This limited resources shared by others is a tragedy of the common structure. And each, in other words, the way that this picture is put together is a way that they often evolve. Most people look at these frequently recurring structures and they're all negative. I mean, if you have one, you don't want it. Though if you start out to fix a problem and promote growth, you look at it and say, okay, I know that nothing grows forever. So if I'm setting out to promote growth, let me go look for things that are actually likely to be limiting factors so I can get rid of them before they become a limiting factor. Or I know that if I have two individuals or teams or companies who are actually trying to develop a synergistic relationship, let me look for ways that they might actually sabotage their own success because of focusing on their own success as opposed to focusing on the success of each other. So if you work through this structure, in other words, things get better and then they get worse because of unexpected consequences, which typically develops into a shifting the burden structure, which typically devolves into an addiction structure. So that, and once you get to the addiction structure, even if you remove the problem, that you're still trying to solve the symptom. In other words, whatever the reason was for becoming an addict is removed, you're still addicted.
Yeah, I can see these in two ways, actually. One way is building blocks for building as part of building models. And the second way is to put some intelligence into the tool that recognizes one of these negative building that says you've compiled a negative building block. You need to consider factors that you haven't considered so far. And you sort of talked your way through it and says, if you get into this situation, you're in a positive feedback loop, and you need to find the dampening factors. You didn't use these words, but you need to find the dampening factors that will reduce the loop, the magnitude of the loop or whatever. And so
right.
it would be useful to be, once that's recognized, to build that into the modeling tool that tells you you've got yourself into into an undesirable situation because you haven't considered a certain type of factor. I suppose this would be similar to TRIZ in that the model would recognize a pattern and then recognize what people have done to get out of that pattern situation.
While there are packages that I'm aware of that will identify loops when you create them, I'm not aware of one that has yet figured out how to identify higher order structures and let you know about them.
Well, you start with recognizing you've got yourself into a positive feedback loop. Are you sure you want to be in that situation? Just to be able to tell you the situation, like in systems engineering, I built a tool that says, this is a poorly written requirement because it's using certain words that are not measurable. Well, it won't tell you every type of poorly written requirement, but it will pick out a few. And so over the years, the tools can upgrade themselves or get better as we learn more about what's going on. The tools evolve. Paul's hands up.
So when
Paul, go ahead.
when I find myself in having developed the relationships that seem to make sense and finding myself in this situation, then I have to go ahead and figure out which ones, because I mean, here are two loops connected. Here's a loop. Here's two loops connected. There's two loops connected. Here's two loops connected. All right. So I mean, it's
that's what we systems engineers use n-square charts for. It's much, or design structure matrix. It's much easier to see which loops are to see the connections and then aggregate them together into a larger block.
Can you send me a reference?
Yeah.
It's something that I've not heard about.
Just a moment.
A lot of work was done up at MIT with that.
I can actually pull something out of one of my classes and show it to you right now. Let me.
Joe, while you're looking for that, Paul, did you have a comment?
Yeah, so it's kind of a related question to what's going on. So, Gene, with frequent structures that you showed, so when you're with people, it sounds like you. So I guess the question is, do you point them to the frequently recurring structures, or do you just start guiding them to represent whatever situations are of interest to them, and then later you'll maybe bring in the frequently recurring structures and say, hey, look, it looks like this might be you could simplify it by using this structure, and here's how. Well, how do you
I do it later. In other words, I don't want to derail any aspect of them conveying what's on their mind, what it is that they're wrestling with.
Yeah.
But but the whole idea of what I commented about Ackoff's comment about wherever you think the problem is, the real problem is somewhere else. Consistently, I mean, it just, and what we identify are symptoms. Symptoms give us pain, and we have to figure out what this thing about beating up on the sales department because sales are falling, and investigating it and finding out, well, it's a growth and underinvestment scenario because you wanted success, but you built the production line to actually keep up with demand. And the customers are tired of waiting for their product and they're buying somewhere else. So
Okay, so when you bring it in later, it's probably not even the same session you're in with them. It might be 2 or 3 sessions later, right?
oh
Before
yeah,
you
I
bring it-
mean, it's because I usually find that it takes me a while to sort things out. Right?
yeah,
I mean, probably the worst case was unbelievably large customer who wanted to better understand all of their processes. And we spent months and we developed something that looked like the Afghan strategy model. I mean, it was, and then they wanted to turn it into a simulation model. And we did that too. And they loved it. And I woke up one morning and I said, shit, it's just a shifting the burden structure. They're spending all their time focusing on the symptoms. Now, if I'd have told them on day one, I could have got fired. That was the last thing they wanted to hear. But we worked them into realizing what it was that they were doing. Would have been good if we'd have realized it a lot sooner so that it wouldn't have cost them quite so much money.
The alternative is you get fired. 'Cause I've
Sooner or
been
later,
fired.
you get fired.
Yeah. Yeah. I've had that experience. What do you mean you figured out our problem in 4 hours?
We've
Okay,
been wrestling
that
with
was-
it for 4 years now.
Yeah, they had been, just about.
So
okay.
what
Let's pretend you're in my class and I'll tell you what an n squared chart is.
Yeah,
So if
there it is.
I go into presentation mode, come on. This is the bubble chart that you were showing.
okay.
And what you need to do is aggregate them into more complex but simpler at the higher level. And it's very difficult to see that way. So what we do is we draw them in a table format like so, where each of those bubbles is the block in the middle, that red block in the middle. And just to save space, we take out the row and column labels and stick them in the middle. And then we draw relationships where the outputs are in the horizontal squares. So A has an output to B, B has an output to A, and the inputs are in the vertical. So you can see that D has inputs from C, B, and A. And then what we do is we start grouping them like this. And then you can end up with 4 higher level blocks, a block A, a block B, C, D, a block E, F, G, and a block H. Something like this. But what I've shown is just one way of grouping them because there's this way, there's this way.
Could you go back to the initial chart, please?
I mean, this one?
Yes, thank you. Okay, and go to the one you ended up with.
Now I'm assuming I got all the links right.
Keep going. One more. One more.
I can either draw it in the bubble format or in the table format. But in the table format, it's easier to see the groupings
Okay.
because I could group them differently like that, or I could group them like this. So the n squared chart shows you possible ways of aggregating them. It doesn't tell you which one to pick. There's the one to pick is the one that optimizes or minimizes the interfaces.
Okay.
I'll talk about that in session 6. Here's a different way.
Okay. Look forward to it.
If I can ask Dr. Kasser, how do you accommodate in the n squared the A goes back to A or B goes back to B. I'm thinking more of a transition matrix for a Markov chain, but I don't see how that's represented in your representation there.
You mean A goes back to A after a delay?
Yeah, there's some fraction of A goes back to A before it goes downstream.
The n squared chart is not a tool for
Okay,
that kind of problem.
okay. That's a good, I like that answer.
Well, we're about
So
out.
it's,
Sorry,
sorry,
we're
Nope.
about
I'm good.
we're about out of time. I'd like to thank our presenters and our attendants, our attendees. And the plan is to process the recordings and post them on the website inside the sessions. The videos will go up on YouTube and there'll be a link inside the session to them. I will send out an email to everybody through Everbright once the videos are up. Their session will be password protected for at least 30 days. And I'm going to turn the recording off now, and then I'm going to tell you the password verbally. No, actually, I can put the password in the chat. And the word is in 3 words in lowercase. It will be in the email.
And that is in lowercase, even though it automatically capitalizes.
Oh, okay. It is in.
Where?
So thank you very much for attending.
And
I'm going to
thank you very much
Where
for
was-
participating.
Where was the password?